think it's a good idea.
Yeah, go up to Greg.
I'm a redneck, so yeah, I think it's a good idea. I think it's economically good. We'll have control of our own pipelines and make our own decisions instead of being puppets to Ottawa.
For most of the 25% of Albertans who support separating from Canada, this is as deep as the issue gets. Good for the economy. We can have all the pipelines we want. Ottawa can't tell us what to do. But the reality is so much more complex than the popular narrative. For example, just what is the process for a province that wants to secede from Confederation? Turns out there are 6 distinct steps. 1, there has to be a clear referendum question. 2, a clear majority result in the referendum. 3, all parties, which includes all the provinces and the federal government, must negotiate in good faith. 4, there is an endless list of issues to be negotiated. 5, negotiation would be followed by a constitutional amendment. 6, if Alberta somehow managed to navigate all of those gauntlets, then it would have to seek international recognition, which would only be granted if Canada agrees. To explain just how complex this process would be, I'm joined by political scientist Lisa Young from the University of Calgary. Welcome to the interview, Lisa.
Happy to be here.
The reason I wanted to talk to you today is because there's been a lot of hot air coming out of Alberta and to a lesser extent Saskatchewan about the provinces separating from Canada. And of course, the secessionist in chief, Premier Danielle Smith, has been making noises about this and talking about a referendum question and so on. So I did a little research, and oh my gosh, the process for a province to secede from the Confederation is so onerous, so onerous. I mean, it would be lifetimes before it would ever happen. Is that a correct reading of this?
It absolutely is. And I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that this is not Canada's first rodeo with a province with notions of secession, right? So, through most of my lifetime, the question of Quebec's desire to secede, or, some Quebecers' desire to secede, has been one of the sort of central drivers of Canadian politics. And we've had 2 referendums, and the second one of those came awfully close. And this then raises the question for Canada of, okay, what if the outcome had been different? What if that had been a 51% yes vote? And so the federal government took this to the Supreme Court through a reference case, the secession reference. And then based on what the Supreme Court said, and the Supreme Court clearly sort of said, why are you asking us this question? We don't want to be the ones that set out exactly what would happen. They threw things back to Parliament, and Parliament then acted. And so unlike, I think, just about any country in the world, Canada does have legislation that sets out how a province can leave. And that you might think that makes it really easy for a province to leave, but you'd be wrong. So what the Clarity Act says is, first of all, if you want your referendum to be taken seriously, if you want it to, if it has an outcome, a yes outcome, if you want the federal government and the other provinces to deal with it, you need to have a clear question. And Parliament gets to decide if the question is clear or not in advance, right? So right there, you've got, the federal government playing a role. And then you need a clear outcome. Right. It can't, and I think Parliament then, my recollection is, would play a role in sort of saying, what is the standard? Right. You're going to jump in here.
Before we get too far down, let's talk about the referendum question a little bit, because a couple of things come to mind. First of all, if Parliament has to approve, then it depends on which government. I mean, I'm having a hard time thinking of a party, either the Liberals or the Conservatives, that would want to be forming government. And when this question comes to Parliament, who wants to be the party that tore Canada apart? Right? You'd probably never be elected again. because of that. So the chances of it getting through Parliament would be slim. And then I would think that whatever the outcome was, sorry, if there was something, if it was positive to success, it would be taken to the Supreme Court, and maybe again and again.
Certainly, the stakes are so very high, right? So, we can imagine scenarios where there's a question and Parliament says, no, we don't think that that's a clear question. And then, the province that wants to hold the referendum could take that to court. We think this is a clear question. Let's litigate that. A couple of years have now passed, right? None of this happens quickly, right? Is the first thing. And so you say, well, why not just go ahead and have your referendum without getting Parliament to sign on? And you certainly can do that, but then it doesn't imply that the federal government would have to negotiate with you, right? So if you ask, a question like, do you think that Saskatchewan should become independent while still maintaining Canadian citizenship and the Canada Pension Plan? You can have your referendum, and then, you can take your result to the federal government, which could say, that's nice. That's not a clear question. We have no obligation to negotiate, right? So the bar is set pretty high for entry into this whole process that you're talking about.
Right. I mean, okay, so you start with a clear referendum question. And then what is a clear majority? Is that 50 plus one? Is it 60%? Is it some other arbitrary number? That hasn't been set either, has it?
That's right. And, if I were the federal government under those circumstances, if you want to set 50% as the bar, well, 50% of eligible voters, right? Not 50% of those who show up, for example, right? So there are all kinds of ways that you can make this difficult, and rightly so, because this is, of course, an enormous thing that we're talking about, right? And that's why the Clarity Act was brought in the first instance, because it became clear how vulnerable Canada was to, secessionist referendums coming from Quebec based on less than clear questions and without a clear consensus about what kind of an outcome was necessary.
So we've got, you have to have a clear question. You have to have a clear majority, both of which are difficult by themselves. Then there's a constitutional duty to negotiate. But both the federal government, the other provinces, everybody, all the parties involved have to negotiate in good faith, which that's another, sort of murky term that it could mean this, could mean that. And you can imagine with all of these parties at the table negotiating, what a free-for-all that would be.
Absolutely. It's an extraordinarily difficult negotiation, obviously, and it would involve very significant things, right? So what would be the seceding province's share of the national debt? Does the province that's leaving get, its 10% of the military or not? What would be the citizenship rights, if any, of residents of the province that was leaving? Like, what do you do with pension contributions? All of these sorts of things. And, those are just the ones they're top of mind, right? It's, actually negotiating something like this would be extraordinary.
There's a number of issues that come up, and the first one is the Canada Pension Plan, because I remember when Premier Smith a couple of years ago was talking about creating an Alberta pension plan, and then the question was how much would Alberta be entitled to? It's only 12.5% of the population. And she came back and said 50%. We're only a small percentage, but we want half. And then an economist, I think it was Professor Trevor Tome from the University of Calgary, who came back and said, no, 23%. And I still thought that was ridiculous. I mean, how do you get to be 12.5% and you want 23% of all of the pension money? And then the First Nations. I mean, there's 3 or 4 treaties on Alberta. In fact, most of the province is covered by treaty. How would that get negotiated?
Yeah, and here I think is in some ways the first, and I would argue the most significant barrier to having this conversation. And here I'm going to inflict a little history lesson on your viewers, because I think that we need to remember that the way that Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba joined Canada is different than the other provinces. These were not colonies or political entities that decided that they would enter into confederation, right? This was Rupert's Land. It was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. It became a territory. And with the view to turning the prairie provinces into provinces, the Canadian government started to negotiate treaties with the Indigenous communities that were the traditional occupants of the land. And the Canadian government's interpretation of these treaties was that Indigenous communities were ceding the land to the Canadian state in return for a guarantee of protection moving forward. The oral histories of those treaties since suggest that that was not the understanding of the Indigenous communities. They were letting settlers come and use the land. They did not understand themselves to be ceding the land. But one way or another, the Canadian state, the Crown, entered into these treaties for as long as rivers run. Now, we've messed up the rivers in all sorts of ways, but fundamentally, that's a notion of in perpetuity. And so the notion that 50% of the population of Alberta could vote and expect to simply, abrogate those treaty relations is entirely problematic, right? And this is the entire province that we're talking about, and the leaders of the treaty organizations in what's we call Alberta have come out to say, like, no, you don't get to do this, right? Our relationship is with the Canadian government. And so this is not, and then the provinces come back to say, oh, you can have a referendum, but it can't affect treaty rights. And that's just silly, because fundamentally, if you start talking about severing the relationship between Alberta and Canada, you are affecting treaty rights right there.
I'll tell you, back in the 90s, I did some work with the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, and they were involved in treaty land entitlement arguments. And so there was a lot of negotiation back and forth over that issue. We don't have to relitigate it here, but only to say that I sat in on meetings where there were chiefs and high-ranking officials, and the way they view this treaties is entirely different. They are not just another category of Canadian, right?
Yeah.
They think of them entirely different. They're sort of part of Canada, sort of not part of Canada. They have the land is as you say, we didn't give it to you. We just agreed to allow you to occupy it, use it, whatever the word might be, but you don't own it. We still own. And I would imagine, that conversation would be extraordinarily difficult, as press releases and public statements from the existing chiefs have made very clear.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is an enormous barrier, of course, and rightly so. And I think one of my many objections to this secessionist movement is the cavalier way that it treats the obligations that we have as treaty people in the province of Alberta.
Boy, isn't that the truth? And one of the reasons why we're having this interview is because there is this sense within that secessionist movement, the Wexit, call it what you will, that really it's kind of easy. That and they're lulling the some of the not a large percentage of the Alberta population, but not an insignificant percentage of the Alberta population into this thinking that there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Getting to the pot of gold is really easy. All we need is a little political will, and we'll just pull it off. And yeah, not going to happen. So let's talk about the fifth step in this process, which is a constitutional amendment that has to be agreed upon by all 10 provinces unanimously and the federal government. And anybody who knows anything about Canada knows that nothing is ever unanimous.
Yeah. We tried our hand at constitutional amendment, in the 1990s, and I shouldn't laugh because it's actually, I think, a problem for the country. But, the takeaway was that we can't reopen the Constitution because it's impossible to get agreement and move forward. Now, the day may come when that's not the case, but the experience of the Meech Lake and then Charlottetown Accords is that if you open up the Constitution to talk about one set of issues, in this case, it was the place of Quebec, then there's a whole host of others who would very much like their issues to be discussed as well. And that includes, of course, Indigenous communities. And so, the idea that Alberta could vote to separate and there would be a negotiation, we'd set this up and then, all of the provinces would agree. It's implausible at best.
Well, here's another thing, and we'll talk about point number 6, implementation and recognition, because there are international laws that govern this sort of thing. And as I understand it, no other state would recognize Alberta unless Canada recognizes secession.
Yeah.
When Canada says, yes, we agree, you can secede, you can go become your own government, or even become the 51st state for that matter. But nothing happens until the federal government, the government of Canada says yes. Until that point, nobody will recognize it and do business with you.
Yeah, I mean, assuming that we're operating in the context of rule of law, that is absolutely the case. Now, can we imagine scenarios where it was otherwise, where Alberta could unilaterally secede, say, gosh, we're free today, here we go? Sure. And then it's a question of who your friends are in the world and whether they back your assertion of independence, right? But you probably need more military force on the ground than the Alberta sheriffs to pull something like that off.
Well, and I guess, off camera, you and I were talking about this, where the only plausible scenario would be somebody, U.S. president like Donald Trump, who intervenes and through force of, just throwing its weight around, they could make that happen. I'm sure it would be not a very friendly conversation, but that's about it. Other than that,
Yeah.
it's highly unlikely.
Yeah. The only way that I think that Alberta ends up outside of Canada in the foreseeable future is with significant intervention from the United States, right? And that means that everything that we've talked about here is probably a moot point because it's a question of military might rather than rule of law.
Yeah, and I think the point here, the message to the viewers is that as you said, short of military or some kind of intervention from the United States, the process as it's been laid out by the Supreme Court, by the Clarity Act, and so on, is just it's just ponderous. I mean, it would take, decades to get through it if you could get through it, and then you probably can't.
Okay.
And when this comes up around the dinner table or family gatherings or around the lunch table, wherever it is, and somebody inevitably starts spouting off about Alberta separation, they can point to this and say, here are the specific parts of the process that would make that almost like virtually impossible. 99.9%, it's impossible. And that's what we want to do, is give folks a little bit of ammunition to push back against this glib, oh, it's not, it's easy, let's just have the referendum.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. And I think there are things that some of the people who are pushing the idea are saying in sort of a way that would be unproblematic that really have to be examined, right? So there's this notion of, well, we could all keep our Canadian passports. And, maybe Canada would agree to that, but all of this is governed by the Citizenship Act, and that's an act of Parliament, and it can change, and it presumably would change in the context of a province actually seceding. So, the idea that Canada would just cheerfully say, okay, off you go then, best of luck, is implausible, right? And
Yes, hopelessly naive.
yeah, and I think one of the big differences here, if we think about Quebec, I do think that English Canadians at some level sort of look at Quebec secessionists and, aren't keen on the idea, but understand the national impulse in some ways, right? These are, the descendants of a people with a common language, who are different in significant ways from the rest of Canada, from the rest of North America.
Right.
Whereas, Alberta, when we look at the public opinion data about why people are suggesting secession, it's wanting lower taxes, right? And that's going to engender less sympathy from people in the rest of the country. And those are, in fact, the people who will be holding the cards if you're trying to negotiate.
Right. I want to wrap up the interview with this question, Lisa, because it, I'm trying to wonder what Premier Danielle Smith's strategy is here, because she's made it easier to bring a referendum forward. She's hinted that she would, if groups want to bring a referendum forward, we would entertain that. So she's playing footsie with the secessionist movement. But she's made some very curious comments. I know you're a professor of political science. She said, "Oh, I'm only doing it for leverage." I'm sorry. The fact that you just said you were doing it for leverage, your leverage just disappeared, because now everybody knows you're not serious. So why should we even listen to you? I mean, it's such a silly, disorganized kind of approach to this. I don't know what to say to it. Is there some sort of genius behind this strategy?
Um, if we think about the reasons why Danielle Smith might be doing this, one might be that she's a true believer, right? And that's possible. Another might be that she thinks it's in her political self-interest, in the sense that the secessionist impulse is strong within her own party. She is well aware that these are people who can organize and get rid of a premier relatively effectively, right? So she wants, so that this is an attempt to appease them by letting them have their referendum. And, here we insert the reference to Brexit and how that turned out. But the other, and I think probably most credible view is that there's a deeply held belief in conservative circles in Alberta that Quebec gets everything that it wants within Confederation because it has a credible threat of secession. And if Alberta wants to get everything that it wants within Confederation, then it needs to offer a credible threat of secession, right? And obviously, announcing that that's why you're doing it makes it a less credible threat, right? And the numbers make it a less credible threat. But if we think about how Prime Minister Carney is going to approach the question of pipelines and other things, is he going to throw Alberta some bones to try to put this referendum question away? It's possible that he will, right? In the short term, it might bolster the province's position. How long that will last isn't clear to me. And what happens when Quebec's demands and Alberta's demands are diametrically opposed, right? If you've got two groups saying, you're in real trouble politically here if you don't do X, and they're different things, who do you choose, Alberta or Quebec, right? And one of these places has twice as many electoral seats as the other.
That's a whole nother discussion, I think, and one of many that needs to be had. So, but we'll leave it this for now. Lisa, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.